It's good to be with you. Let me make a couple of distinctions to start off and explain something of what I want to try and do with you this evening. First of all, it's a pretty flashy title, Meeting Jesus in the Voting Booth. I suspect if you're like me and you went into the voting booth in November and you met Jesus, you probably would get freaked out. But I think what we're trying to say to that is that the exercise of conscientious voting is in many ways an opportunity for us to confront some of our deepest beliefs and to have some encounter with the God we believe in, who leads us into deeper truth and leads us into a deeper understanding of what it means to love our neighbor. And I think the way into that, within the Christian tradition at least, is really by focusing on the importance of the exercise of conscience when we vote. Let me quote to you, just very briefly, a passage from a very important document, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, from the Second Vatican Council back in 1965. This is one of the key documents that was issued by the bishops assembled at Vatican II to sort of reflect upon what is the meaning of faith in our own time. And in paragraph 16, they say the following: deep within their consciences, men and women discover a law which they have not laid upon themselves, yet which they must obey. Its voice, ever calling them to love and to do what is good and to avoid evil, tells them inwardly at the right moment, do this, avoid that. For they have in their hearts a law inscribed by God. Their dignity rests in observing this law, and by it they will be judged. Conscience is the most secret core and the sanctuary of the human person. There they are alone with God, whose voice echoes in their depths. By conscience, in a wonderful way, that law is made known which is fulfilled in the love of God and love of neighbor. Through loyalty to conscience, Christians are joined to all others in the search for moral truth and for the right solution to so many problems which arise both in the life of individuals and in social relationships. So the first thing I want to suggest to you is that what's meant by this title, Meeting Jesus, Meeting God in the Voting Booth, is in a very real sense mediated by the experience of you and I acting conscientiously. It's precisely by you and I informing our consciences and wrestling with the truth as best as we can conscientiously come to know it, that we come into contact with the living God of truth and love. The second thing I want to say to begin is this. One of the great pleasures that I've gotten out of this campaign, and without being overly cynical, I can't say I've gotten lots of pleasures out of this campaign, but really one of the great pleasures of this campaign has been the energy I've seen around it exhibited by so many young people like yourself. Quite frankly, as you probably know, participation by younger generations has not been particularly good in the last 20 to 30 years in this country. And that indeed there's a fair amount of voter apathy and political apathy manifested among the young every bit as much, and even more so, as manifested among older voters. So it's actually a pleasure to see so many young people like yourselves here and to be interested in a topic like this. I should say, I also presume that all of you who are here are probably Red Sox fans who have given up by now. Because I figured if you're Yankee fans, you'd be home rooting against the Red Sox. So I'm presuming you're sort of hopeless Red Sox fans. But while voting is important, let me suggest to you an insight that Václav Havel, the distinguished playwright, poet, novelist, who was a resistor to the communist regime in Czechoslovakia, and then became one of the presidents of that early Czech Republic. Havel made a statement years ago which I thought was very wise. He said, democracies do not begin with elections. They end with elections. They begin with conversations. And what he meant was, of course, in the repressed societies such as Czechoslovakia, people did not feel free to speak publicly and openly. People did not experience the freedom and the opportunity to share their deepest convictions and their political hopes. People did not feel free to trust another, to convey to them, well, this is the regime I do like or don't like. These are my criticisms of my political leaders. No one knew who was a tool of the state and who, in fact, could be trusted with honest political speech. And so for Havel, one of the mistakes states can make, and I realize I'm older than many of you in this room, though not all perhaps, but we have seen in our own time a rush to elections in certain states that were not at all prepared to have genuine democratic elections, because they were states that didn't have a sufficient mass of Democrats. And I mean that with a small d, not a big D. That is, you need a sufficient number of people in a society who are committed to democratic ideals before you can have a genuine democracy. It's not enough just to have bunting and speeches and campaign slogans and bumper stickers. That does not make genuine democracy. Open, honest, political conversation. People trying to speak meaningfully about the social issues before them. Honest and civil conversations among fellow citizens. That's what's needed in order to have an effective democracy. That's how we reach out to one another. That's how we become responsible citizens. So let me suggest, while I'm going to talk an awful lot about voting and what I'm about to say, I want to be very clear with you that as important as voting is, it is far more important in my mind, and I agree with Havel on this, that we become the sorts of people who engage in open and honest and civil conversation with one another about the issues of moment in our society and culture. And that holds true not only in an election year, it holds true in the life of U.S. society in any year. Otherwise, we simply go through a ritual every 4 years. The political ritual of voting is not what we need nearly as much as good conversation in our society. And I hope that what I'll say this evening will at least occasion some good conversation among us tonight, but more importantly, good conversation with friends and family back in the dorms or back in your homes, around the kitchen table, over the phone with friends and loved ones who are not here. A couple of distinctions. As voters, we must not forget the distinction between moral principle and their application in the political order. What I'm suggesting here is, it is possible to agree on an important moral value or principle, and yet disagree in good conscience on the way the principle is to be applied in the public realm. Let me give an example that those who lived in Boston a few decades ago will understand, and those of you who are young may not even know about. But a very hot issue here in Boston a number of decades ago revolved around the question of forced busing of school children. Now, both Mr. A and Mrs. B may be equally dedicated to the principle of equal educational opportunity for children of all races. But Mr. A and Mrs. B may disagree profoundly on whether a compulsory plan of forced school busing is the best approach to securing equal educational opportunity. So people can agree at the level of moral principle and yet disagree reasonably at the level of how that principle gets applied in political judgments. There's another distinction we need to keep in mind besides principle and application, and that is the distinction between the moral law that we heard about in that passage from Gaudium et Spes and the civil law. Citizens ought not to presume that every element of the moral law, as they understand it, can or should be translated into civil law. To put it simply, not every sin is a crime, and it would be impossible to enforce such a viewpoint. Drunkenness, lying, verbal cruelty about others, fornication, masturbation. There are any number of things that Christian communities teach to be wrong morally that it would simply be impossible to enforce as civil law. Not all sins are crimes or could be made crimes. Now, Christian voters, as well as their leaders, and in the case of the Catholic Church, their bishops, are encouraged to examine the position of the candidates on the full range of issues, as well as judge candidates on their integrity, their overall political philosophy, and their skillful performance in living out their political responsibilities. For decades, the American bishops in the Catholic Church, for instance, have been very clear that they do not wish to form a religious voting bloc. They do not want to form a Catholic political party. They do not want to instruct persons as to how to vote by endorsing or opposing specific candidates. Instead, what the bishops have done is they have issued a statement every 4 years since the mid-'80s. The most recent version of this is called Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, readily available for downloading as a PDF on the web. It's about 36 pages of double-spaced text. Not a particularly difficult read. And in that document, as they've done every 4 years, they propose a framework, an ethical framework whereby they believe devout Christians can engage political life. This framework encourages taking seriously the duties of citizenship in a democracy, to be an informed and an active voter, for one thing at least. The framework does not treat all issues as morally equivalent, nor does it reduce Christian concerns to 1 or 2 issues. The point is to use the framework, sometimes called the consistent ethic of life, to examine how candidates stand on issues affecting human life and human dignity. Now, a few weeks ago, the bishops of the Diocese of Brooklyn and Rockville Center in New York. If you haven't figured it out by now, this is a Brooklyn accent you're listening to, all right? The Diocese of Brooklyn covers the 2 western parts of Long Island, the counties of Kings, better known as Brooklyn, and Queens County. The Diocese of Rockville Centre covers Nassau and Suffolk counties. So between those two dioceses, it's the entire entity of Long Island are under those two dioceses. The two bishops who govern those two dioceses in the church submitted a letter to the New York Times a few weeks ago. And in that letter, they made the point that the Catholic Church does not teach that abortion is the only issue, but it does teach that it is an issue of high moral importance, that nonetheless must be seen, quote, within the context of the Church's teaching on justice, peace, service to the poor, and promoting the common good. Now, if you hear that kind of roster of concerns, what should become immediately obvious is that that kind of moral teaching is a notoriously poor fit for the present political spectrum in this country. That is, in the United States, it is difficult to find any candidate who consistently embraces an ethic, a consistent ethic of life across the board. So then what does one do if one takes this teaching seriously? What does one do when one enters a voting booth? When candidates may seem to embody some, but not all, of the values and principles that one wants to hold as a faithful Christian. Let me propose a few fundamental ideas that you and I can work through as we think about how to be faithful as believers and be responsible as citizens. Being a responsible participant in a democratic political order normally will entail voting. That is a serious duty, but it is not an absolute duty. The bishops, for instance, in their document are clear that a person who conscientiously decides that no candidate can be supported with their vote, with one's vote, is not the same situation as a person who does not vote out of apathy. To the extent that our votes get bundled together with other people who vote, contributing to a person winning an election, that does not mean, however, that a particular voter is morally responsible for all the policies pursued by a winning politician. This is where a very traditional principle in the Christian moral life comes into play. It's called the principle of double effect. And basically what this principle suggests is that most of our actions in our world today have more than one effect. Most of what we do doesn't just cause one thing, but often what we do causes multiple things. And sometimes what we do creates some good, but it also creates some harm. A classic example from the ethical tradition would be the surgeon who engages in, say, amputation to save someone from a serious illness. That act of surgery does at least two things. Hopefully one is save a life, but it also mutilates a body. It also causes significant emotional and psychological harm to someone to lose a limb. And yet at the same time, the surgeon does this conscientiously, believing that they're also saving a life. Now, if we lived in a world where we said you can never harm anyone, or you can never do anything bad to someone, we'd be paralyzed. Because it's precisely sometimes in pursuing a good that we also bring about a certain measure of harm. And what the principle of double effect recognizes, you see, is precisely because our actions have multiple effects, that we have to sometimes judge moral actions by the balance they contain of how much good are they bringing about, even as we recognize that they also may be bringing about a certain measure of harm. For example, you vote for candidate A because you want to lower the abortion rate. But by voting for candidate A, you also include his openness to the use of harsh interrogation methods against detainees. Support for a candidate is not the same as supporting everything the candidate believes. That is, people can say, I am choosing this candidate because of this hopeful outcome of the election. I recognize this may also come as part of it, but I do not support this, and in fact, I may disavow it, but that still may allow me to vote for candidate A because of the good that I believe will come about by choosing this person. This is a very important and traditional norm within the Christian tradition. A second important principle to keep in mind is the principle of cooperation. Suppose you and I recognize that there were going to be some morally problematic consequences if I vote for candidate A. But the line of my voting as a single voter for candidate A and the results of some of candidate A's choices and policies in the years ahead is not a direct line of causality, but in fact it's a fairly complicated, twisting, and indirect line of causality. Pope Benedict XVI has made it clear, for instance, that you can vote for candidates who support morally wrong policies as long as you are not voting for the candidate because of those policies, but despite those policies. And what might allow you to do that? If there is a proportionate amount of good that is created by tolerating the wrong that comes with it. This is an example of what is called in the tradition material cooperation. You are not voting in agreement with the harm or the negative consequences of what a candidate's doing, but you're voting for that candidate despite those things because of the desired good effects of voting for this candidate. After all, as you and I know, voting for a candidate is no guarantee that the candidate's stated policies are ever going to be implemented. The candidate may change his or her mind after an election. The candidate's proposals might be defeated in the legislature. They might be overturned by the courts, and so on. In other words, the specific evil deeds that may come about because of a given leader's decision, that our soldiers may target non-combatants in a war, or that a biologist may be given federal funding that destroys embryos for medical research. Those things may be very far removed, both in time, in location, and even personal involvement from anything you did when you voted in a voting booth. What all this suggests, in other words, is that the specific action of voting for a candidate is a very different thing from endorsing specific evil outcomes that may or may not happen as a result of voting for that candidate. Now, when we are talking about conscience and being conscientious people, the great virtue in the tradition regarding conscience is the virtue of prudence. Now, prudence for many of us in the modern age has a connotation of the prudent person is the hesitant person, the reluctant person, the overcautious person. But that's not how it's used in the tradition. Rather, when you hear prudent or the virtue of prudence in the Christian tradition, think more of what today we tend to talk about when we use the term wisdom. The prudent person is the really wise person. The prudent person is the sort of person you or I seek out when we want to get good advice. The prudent person understands what's really at stake here. what's going on? What are all the ramifications that are in play in this decision? What's the likely outcome of this? What's a possible outcome of this? What are the various options before me? And which of those options gets the most good and the least amount of harm? Prudence is what permits an individual to make that kind of smart choice. Now, when you and I, a prudent person, when we go into the voting booth, what are the issues that arise for us? Well, one question is, should we give some issues greater weight than we give to other issues? Secondly, do some issues have more room for discretionary judgment and more room for disagreement among peoples than other issues? Now, as you may be aware, a lot of Christian churches distribute voting guides at church services at this time of the year, suggesting that, oh, true Christians vote this way, or vote on these issues this way, or vote for this candidate this way. And more often than not, these voting guides are at least subtly biased and trying to push people to vote one way or the other, either by the issues they highlight or the issues they tend to ignore and soft pedal. Now, the misrepresentation here, it seems to me, comes in two ways. First, these guides suggest that there are some issues that are simply non-negotiable. There are some issues that this is simply wrong, period, end of story, as if though that would then remove any exercise of prudence on the part of the voter. Now, certainly there are basic moral principles and values that are non-negotiable because they lie at the very center of our faith. However, the question of how best to embody these principles when comparing candidates on a whole range of them still demands the exercise of prudence. For example, even the Catholic bishops in this country disagree with each other about the strategy to oppose abortion. They do not disagree about the morality of abortion. They're clear in consensus in opposition to abortion. But they do disagree as to what's the best legislative or judicial strategy to work against abortion. So prudence is never to be removed from the calculus of Christian voting. We always have to ask, what's the best way of interjecting our Christian values into the political system? Now, the other side of the equation is also true. Just as it is wrong to act as if the official moral teaching of the church settles all the political questions and removes prudence from our decision-making, it's also wrong to think that prudence eliminates all attention to the official teaching of our churches. On many topics, there is an acceptable range of opinion compatible with Christian values. But that doesn't mean that everything is compatible with our Christian values. Because the death penalty, for example, and war are both topics subject to legitimate disagreement and a legitimate diversity of opinion, that does not mean that any recourse to capital punishment is justifiable. It does not mean that any war fought by one's nation is a just war. Taking up arms to stop genocide is very different from taking up arms to initiate genocide. Fighting in self-defense is very different from fighting to expand regional influence or gain access to natural resources. The role for prudence is to assist us in deciding how best to apply my Christian values. It's not an excuse for bracketing my Christian values in the voting booth. Now, another element here is that a candidate may support a position that's quite consistent with your and my moral commitments. But the political office they're running for does not really provide them with the vantage point for addressing the issue. The simple fact of the matter is, no urban mayor is going to be a major player in discussions on torture. No member of the House of Representatives has anything to say about appointments to the Supreme Court. And the truth of the matter is, except in a very small range of cases, no president has anything to do with the death penalty. So someone who might be examined closely on the death penalty as a governor of a state, that same issue becomes considerably less relevant when they run for the office of the President of the United States. Another element here is, as a voter, you may conclude that the political climate on a particular issue is simply not ripe for addressing the issue. That quite simply, there are so many other things that seem to have more pressing urgency at this point in time in the life of this republic, that voting on this issue is largely irrelevant to what the real policy agenda is likely to be for the next 3 or 4 years in our country. Or it may even be that there is a certain candidate whose values and principles you admire and like very much, and yet it's still possible to conclude they simply don't have the political skill or the intelligence or the ability to effectively act on these values that you share with them. Prudence takes into account all these things: the right time, the right person, the right issues about which to vote. Let me conclude then with some comments about issues and context in our voting. Let me be clear. Some issues do weigh more than other issues on the moral scale. Some issues, defense against direct assaults on human life, opposition to deliberate and consistent attacks on essential human rights. These things are deserving of great weight as we think about what's at stake. And there is greater room for disagreement on some issues than there are on others. How best to deliver health care? There's more leeway for debate there, it seems to me, than whether or not we can engage in torture as an interrogation tool. Even here, however, to say that there is room for disagreement in some areas does not mean necessarily that any position on health care is acceptable, or any position on alleviating poverty, or any position on global warming. Church teaching surely points us in a direction which we should be willing to follow. Any candidate who effectively dismisses or denigrates or downplays the claims that the poor may make upon us for basic rights is manifestly acting inconsistently with Christian teaching. When weighing issues, the first error, therefore, is to treat all issues as being of equal moral weight, or all policy options as equally legitimate. The second issue of error is to focus on only one issue, ignoring the rest of Christian teaching, or to concentrate on only one policy choice as if there are no legitimate policy disagreements. Let me try and put this in a fairly, I think, folksy way that I hope will make some sense to you. Mary Smith is a doctor. She's also a wife. She's a mother. She's a daughter. She's a sibling. She's an active parishioner. She's an amateur gardener. She loves to travel and see new and different places. Each of these roles is important. Each of them is useful. Each of them helps to make Mary Smith who Mary Smith is. Yet they're not all equally important. If there are conflicts in those roles, most of us would agree some priorities are clear. But it would be wrong to think that any one of those roles should dominate all the other roles, squeezing out all other responsibilities or duties in those other roles. It may be that at certain times and places, different roles get different values. There are also a variety of ways that Mary can fulfill her roles. As a doctor, helping a patient can take different forms. Contributing to her parish can be done in several ways. Even being a good parent can be expressed in diverse methods. But not all approaches are equally good, even if there is legitimate diversity. And at some point in her life, being a faithful daughter to elderly parents may weigh more heavily than some other role she's playing. At other points in the life of her children, being a good parent may be the role that gets most of her attention. But when her children are 35 and independent, it may well be that some other role looms in importance. In other words, what's key here in Mary's life is integration, balance, judgment. Many things are important. Some things matter more than others. The important thing is to give each good thing its proper due. And there are different ways to try to do this and strike a balance. In short, what Mary needs is prudence in integrating and balancing multiple duties. I want to suggest to you analogously the same thing is true for us in our roles as intelligent, prudent voters. There are many claims upon our votes, and some issues and some goods may loom larger at certain points in our life or in the life of the political society we're in, and at other times recede in importance. The judgments as to, in this time and place, how one strikes that balance of competing goods cannot be solved by some simple one-size-fits-all formula. It has to allow for individuals to exercise prudent judgment. Another area for consideration in voting conscientiously is to consider the concrete political situation in which our vote occurs. This suggests a couple of things. First, it is not always easy to find out where candidates stand on controversial issues, since good politicians tend to be fairly nimble in moving around on the issues when they're before the electorate. Positions shift from primary campaigns to general elections. Different signals get sent to different audiences, and positions are sometimes adopted not out of any great personal conviction, but because they're a way of exploiting the weaknesses of one's rival. I am not saying that candidates lie, pure and simple, but I am saying that they do shape their message to different audiences at different times. Bill Clinton was famous for having the skill of talking about racial justice before black audiences and white audiences and being heard in two different ways. George Bush, the President George Bush, on abortion in 2000 was very effective when talking about abortion and his opposition to abortion before pro-life groups. But when talking to suburban GOP women, he was very clear to emphasize he would employ no litmus test for court appointments, that he would not push for a constitutional amendment, and he emphasized that he believed in exceptions on banning abortion in cases of rape, incest, and health of the mother. He would not raise those same exceptions when talking to pro-life groups. Even more difficult to assess can be the element of priorities. Just as some issues are more central to you as voters, so too some issues are more central to the candidates. Candidates have to address a wide array of issues, from how much corn should be used in ethanol when they're talking in Iowa, to what one should do for No Child Left Behind in the city of Baltimore. They have to speak to all sorts of issues before all sorts of audiences in an election. But after they're elected, not all those issues are going to get their attention. In short, there's a big difference between taking a position on an issue and intending to do anything about it after you get elected. Again, Bill Clinton could talk eloquently about the need for assisting the poor of this country and about environmental protection. The truth is, he did considerably less than what he talked about during his 8 years. Ronald Reagan and both Presidents Bush had very strong rhetoric talking about abortion, and there has been little substantive change in the policy of this nation during all three of those presidents' time. There is no easy way to resolve this, because you and I cannot read the hearts and minds of candidates. All we can do is make a decision based on how we think a candidate will operate once put in office. It's safe to say, for instance, we all, I think, know this, that after the economic downturn this country has experienced in the last few weeks, it is simply impossible for either Obama or McCain to implement all the programs they have talked about implementing. But if you watched either of the last two debates, they were directly asked by people, directly asked by the moderators, what in your program would you now drop in light of the severe economic downturn? Neither one ever answered the question in either occasion. So we simply do not know necessarily what their priorities will be. We can have educated guesses about it. We can make judgments based upon their record, upon their past experience, upon their life histories. But we cannot know for sure which of these things that may be a big issue in the election actually becomes a fairly secondary issue in an actual presidential term. A final factor, and I will stop here and have some conversation with you. The final factor is timing. In the ebb and flow of politics, some issues emerge and others recede in importance. Think how the Iraq War has dropped out of voters' minds compared to 1 year ago today. Consider how economic issues now dominate compared to, say, the midterm elections of 2006. For most of my adult life, no one even thought about torture as an issue in a presidential election. And now it's a live topic. Will immigration once again rise up as an issue in the next year or two? How about medical technologies and procedures that are going to be coming down the pike in light of the genetic revolution that we are experiencing? There is no guarantee what issues will grab the political imagination of this country. There is no guarantee what issues will really become the burning issues that will occupy the presidency of any individual in this country. There is no guarantee that the person we vote for in November will be the ideal person to address issues that we don't even foresee yet. Which is only to say that the responsibility to be an informed and conscientious and prudent voter continues not just for the month of October, but for all our lives as citizens in a democracy. Thank you.